Good day. This is Inside Law. I'm your host, Gerald Goldfarb. Inside Law is an interview and discussion program where we try to show the inside, realistic way that the legal system works. Many of us are exposed today to kind of fantasized views about the legal system in shows like LA Law. And here on Inside Law, we try to show what is really happening. I'm very proud and happy to have as my guest today the eminent divorce and family lawyer, Marvin Mitchelson. Marvin, welcome to our show.
Nice to see you, Gerald. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Marvin is a graduate of UCLA and of the Southwestern Law School. He's been a member of the bar for over 30 years now, and of course has pressed for some of the most revolutionary changes in divorce law, and has had many famous clients and has really been an innovator. Marvin, maybe we can start off our conversation by finding out a little bit about your history. Now you're an eminent man, but how did you start out as a lawyer?
Well, I'm happy to tell you, Gerald, that I started out completely alone. When I got out of law school back in 1957, when out of law school I passed the bar, of course, and I went around and jobs were hard to get, as they probably are now. So I said I'd open my own office. So I found an office to open, rented it for $100 a month. Now the rent has increased, I guess, about 500-fold. And I had a champagne party, invited everyone I knew. Mm-hmm. Everyone came, but I didn't get any business from those people, but someone brought a friend. Mm-hmm. And I got my first case, and of course my first case was very thrilling to me. Mm-hmm. And I became a specialist in almost everything. I used to put in 15, 20 hours a day, sometimes I still do. But I enjoyed doing that, and so I really started from the ground up and never looked back.
So you started off as a general practitioner then?
General practitioner, and of course we had negligence cases and some divorce cases, and I even had a very interesting case where someone was drummed out of the service short of their 20 years, a lieutenant colonel, and they said he was a malingerer, and I went before the Army Board of Correction of Military Records in Washington, D.C., and after a 2-year fight I won him $300,000 claim. He actually was very ill when they kicked him out. He wasn't a malingerer. And I suddenly had this deluge of business from veterans of foreign wars. And that
one good victory brings in a lot of
it brings in a lot. For a time I thought of going into that field of law, but I decided to turn it over to a Washington colleague who was a little more prepared to handle those kind of cases. But one victory does help you in that regard.
And how did your practice evolve into a divorce specialty?
Well, I was fortunate enough in early 1960s to go to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Douglas versus California, which resulted in a change all over the country, giving indigents the right to a free counsel, which started the right to counsel cases in criminal cases. And Pamela Mason, the wife of the late actor James Mason, heard about that and hired me for a divorce case. I worked very hard on that for a short period of time. That resulted in those days, which was a very large settlement of around $2 million, still is a good settlement, and sort of a headline case. And as a result of that, a lot of the film wives started coming to me and other show business people, and it sort of developed from there and grew a little bit like Topsy and built up.
And you moved out of your $100 a month office.
I wish I had a $100 a month office, but I did move out of it, and have been at it, as I say, for over 30 years.
And you've seen enormous changes, I imagine, in the divorce law in the last 30 years. Just as an overview, Marvin, what are the biggest changes that have happened?
Well, really the biggest change I think that happened, something I was against at the time, thinking it would kill all of our business, but it certainly didn't do that, is the no-fault divorce law that came in 1970. I used to think, gee, there won't be anything to argue about, but of course there's always something to argue about in a divorce case. And that's one for the better because, you know, people washing their dirty linen in the courtroom, everyone is guilty of some kind of fault and makes a contribution to the end of a marriage. It no longer becomes viable, but the real changes...
I mean, I don't even know if the public remembers those days, but we're both getting kind of old. I mean, before the no fault, you had to go into court and prove things like adultery and cruelty, so-and-so beat me, that kind of thing.
You had to prove adultery, desertion, mental cruelty was the common big ground, and that could be anything from not liking your wife's cooking. I remember I had a case once where The husband said, my wife's cooking was so bad, they lived in Palm Springs. He said, I'd rather walk across the desert where snakes are liable to attack me than eat my wife's cooking, and threw it down the sink. Of course, that was a pretty cruel way to treat her.
Yeah.
She's probably a much better cook today. I think she's been married for 4 times now and has probably learned how to do it by now.
Yeah.
But we used to have all kinds of, little tales like that to tell. And I'm glad those days are over. But the big changes in law, to answer your question, are there's no grounds needed for divorce today, almost everywhere in the United States except New York, which is still somewhat archaic. If you just have differences, irreconcilable differences, that's enough. You don't even need a corroborating witness, and you can get a divorce. The other change is, of course, we have a community property system, and while we only have that in 12 states, the rest of the country has what's called equitable distribution of property, but they're leaning toward almost a 50-50 division. Now, to make it very clear, that regards the money that is made from the time you're married to the time you separate that's still intact. It's the earnings, so forth. There's some exceptions to that. And the third big change that's really happening now is in the area of custody. This is really a change for the better, I think, but the courts are tending to give not only, lip service, but in actuality, to give both parents as much equal physical custody as they can. If the parents live in the same neighborhood and all other things being equal, they'll try to divide up the custody and have the child stay for a period of time with the father and a period of time with the mother. So this is becoming a reality. And it's, of course, much easier now when people come into your office to say to them, because that's always been a big problem, the kids are in the middle, and the one parent wants an edge and they're afraid they're going to lose custody. Now it's not the threat it used to be. They say, look, your husband, the father, is going to get to see his kids, whether you like it or not, so get used to the idea. So those are big changes that may make the divorce lawyer obsolete eventually, although they always find something to fight about, as they say.
Yes, they do. And I think you're right about the custody change. The old notion about the father who sees the kid every other weekend, the Disneyland dad, maybe that's diminishing these days, and much for the better.
It's diminishing and much for the better. That child always wants to look at, they're going to have one mother and one father, and they want to be proud of the mother and father, and they want them in their life. And that's something the other parent has to realize.
Now, when people come to see you, whether people are rich or whether people are poor, they must be oftentimes in difficult mental state. Is that true, Marvin, or are people more cold-blooded these days? And what do you do about people who are coming to you and then they're in a state of mental disarray?
It's a big problem, particularly in the divorce area and relationships that break up. Usually, no matter how much they may think about it, one party isn't ready for that divorce, and they're devastated emotionally. They're worried financially what's going to happen, whether it's a man or a woman, whether a man's going to be dividing his kingdom, so to speak, and a woman's worrying how she's going to get along because she wasn't able to get along too well even when they were married. There's usually not enough money to go around. But they're very emotionally, in straits, emotional straits. And if there is severe emotional disturbance, I try to bring in a psychiatrist or a psychologist to try to help them. You can be empathetic as a divorce lawyer, but they're not hiring you to sit there and hold their hand. So you want to be empathetic, but you also want to direct and, move things along and be helpful. I always try to make sure that they're ready for this step. A lot of people will say, well, the divorce lawyers, they make it worse and they create friction, and otherwise people will sell their cases. Not true. When they come, they've been to the priest, the rabbi, the psychologist, the psychiatrist,
the divorce lawyer is the
friends.
last stop.
That's the last stop, and usually it's because the marriage is no longer viable. If I think it's just an argument or a fight, I try to say, cool off and talk it over. But if it's a real thing, then I try to take the steps to protect them, be it a woman or a man.
I don't think people realize how difficult it is to represent clients in divorce cases. Don't you run into the problem where the client says one thing one day and the next week the change of mind, and the next week another change of mind, and your instructions, how can you go forward with your job when they're changing their minds?
You're very much in the middle. As a matter of fact, I think the divorce lawyer is the third party in an inherently two-party situation. And strange as you hardly can ever please anyone completely, because, I remember once, and it was the Pamela Mixon case, where my client had come to me at the time, and I wrote about this in a book called Made in Heaven, Settled in Court, rather aptly named at the time. But When Pamela came to me, she'd been through a couple other lawyers and was sort of disenchanted. Things hadn't gone right. She says, those days, getting $1 million was the proverbial, that was the height to get $1 million. She says, I want to get $1 million. And the night before the trial, I'd subpoenaed 43 witnesses. We were going forward the next morning. We were in about a 2-day negotiating sessions with James' lawyers. And finally, at 1 a.m., I called him. I said, would you take $2 million? And up until this time, she didn't have any kind words for James because they were going through this bitter divorce. I said, would you take $2 million? She says, well, you're joking. I said, no. I'd managed in a 20-hour session to get it up to over $2 million. I said, will you take it? She says, well, of course. And then suddenly she says, poor James, what have they done to him? And in that moment, there was that attempt to protect her husband because she still loved him. And as many men and women still love their wives and husbands, even though they might hurt them in many other ways. But she was ready to attack the lawyer who did, I guess, too good of a job on the husband.
That's
that we don't have that kind of luck all the time that we do that good of a job, but it certainly was a surprise to me to see that true emotion.
Yeah, that's a sweet story, really. That
it
people,
really is. It's very touching.
Going through heated divorces, there is a residue of goodwill often that you can tap.
There is. When you start attacking too much, they want to come to the protection and say, look, it's not all bad, and
Now,
don't do this thing.
A related problem that I've seen arise, I've seen it in the literature particularly, and maybe even in my practice too, is sometimes, particularly like we're men, and female divorce clients will sometimes form a kind of emotional attachment to the lawyer, whether it's you or me or some other divorce lawyer. And I've seen litigation in Illinois. There was a malpractice case in which the Illinois divorce lawyer had intimate relations with his female client, and then later on she sued him for malpractice, saying he hadn't represented her properly. Is that you have that kind of problem?
I would say it's a danger area. Of course, a professional person should certainly try to avoid any kind of attachments to clients that go beyond the attorney-client relationship or even a friendship. You do become friends with people sometimes, and you meet interesting people, but it's almost like moving. You live in a place and then you move to the next place and you go on with your life, and they should be going on with their lives. You're really there to try to get someone over a bridge of troubled waters, to be sure, but that's about as far as it should go. And of course, a lonely woman or another person may come into your life and they feel devastated, and they not only lost their husband, but the friends usually go with the one who has the money, so they can feel very lonely and very troubled, but you're better off just trying to get them a good settlement and getting involved with them.
Well, that's for sure. And sometimes it's hard to deal with clients because of their emotional state. I know one thing that all of we lawyers are concerned about these days is claims of legal malpractice. I know that you, because I think you're in the public eye, I've seen 1 or 2 articles about you being sued for legal malpractice, and other lawyers are too. Well, what do you feel about how that
of course,
is?
no one likes to be sued, but when you're in the business I'm in, I say the third party in a 2-party relationship. I probably been involved in 6,000 cases in over 30 years, and I can say this to you that. You're a target. I'm sort of a target defendant in that sense, because my cases are high profile. And if people don't get what they want sometimes, their expectations are very high, almost on a fantasy level, and they may read about a case where I've had some success. I'm thinking of a case where I got a very large judgment of $83 million, which was the highest one ever given. It didn't collect it all.
That was the fellow, the fellow in Beverly Hills with the nude statues.
Right. And then someone will come in and think, well, they're going to not $83 million, but they should do equally as well. And you can't always do as well. You're as good as the case you have. The difference is if you skillfully present it. So I'm happy to say that so far, I guess knocking on all kinds of wood, none of those cases have been successful. But there are a few that sometimes come along, a few out of a few thousand. So we're all gonna have some charge hurled at us sometime or another in our legal life. Particularly if you're stand-up and you are ready to fight people. I take a lot of cases other lawyers wouldn't touch. They wouldn't touch them because sometimes they don't want to be innovative. They don't want to try to change the law. As a result of which, though, I'm proud to say that I've changed the law significantly in 2 areas. I've given the disenfranchised people who never had a right to walk through the front door of a courthouse the right to have a case, people who live together, the palimony case, Marvin versus Marvin.
Let's talk about the palimony situation. You really were the innovator there. And I think it's changed a lot, the way that people look at marriage and look at divorce. And somebody said to me just this morning, oh, you're having Marvin Mitchelson on. Why don't you ask him why people should even bother getting married anymore? But I think they should.
I think maybe it's driven people to get married more.
I think it has.
I think it's affected it this way. You know, before the Marvin case, there wasn't actually in this country, except for the few states that had common law marriage, the difference being in common law marriage, people intend to hold themselves out as being married in every respect except they didn't get a license. They have the same rights as married people. In the palimony case, which is of course a media word, it's different. You have to show a contract, usually an oral contract. The case of Marvin versus Marvin, the Supreme Court case, laid down several principles of law that allowed a person to walk through the front door of a courthouse, particularly a woman for the first time, and say, look, we had an agreement. He promised me certain things, and I relied on him, and I did my part, and I promised to be his companion, his confidant, whatever have you. So it's a recognition of those relationships. And during the 70s, we had a 1,500% increase in people living together. So we had significantly thousands of people out there who had these relationships, and 15, 20 years might go by, someone breaks up with someone else and says, okay, I don't owe you a thing because you have no rights. That isn't quite fair. Like every other case, there are good cases and there are bad palimony cases. They're a hard sell because people are looking for, you know, permanency in relationships, and there's this idea of people live together, they didn't intend to have any duties or responsibilities.
So the
but that's
judges
hardly
and
ever the
juries
case.
are skeptical when you present a palimony case. When you
Somewhat skeptical, but you can prevail on them if you have the right facts and you have a rather strong case. Usually the better palimony cases are the ones where someone lives together with someone and then they marry them. It's a lot easier to believe they made the promises in the beginning because they ultimately took them to the altar. And when you have children and when you file joint income tax returns, those are strong cases and they're better cases. And as I say, it's a hard sell. I did settle a case recently that almost went to court for $3.5 million, but it involved a case where they'd been living together for 23 years. The man in the relationship, I started to call him the husband, he really was like a husband to this lady, never bothered divorcing his first wife, so he was still married, but they hadn't lived together, the first wife and he. So they did settle that case for $3.5 million. And I saw a case that just absolutely amazed me. It wasn't one of my own. But about 4 months ago or 5 months ago in San Francisco, in a gay case, a man won $1.8 million, pardon me, $2.2 million from his lover, a man he lived with for 17 years, who had the money and had bought a lot of real estate based on the promises that he didn't keep. Now here was a case of gay people, which I've always thought had the same rights, because it's like a partnership.
Well, a contract is a contract,
It's
Marvin.
a contract is a contract, exactly. But here this jury gave him $2.2 million, $800,000 of which was punitive damages. So, I mean, here's a real, talk about an improvement on the original concept. So I sort of took my hat off to that lawyer. I guess it's on appeal, but it shows you how far people have come. I remember just one little thing that when I had the Bloomingdale case a few years ago, and I was trying to show that a man who had a mistress, the mistress also had a right to, you know, partake of with the promises, even though he was living two lives and had a wife as well. And I remember the judge in that case who turned it down at one stage and gave a sort of a summary judgment on part of the case, said to me, said, well, this doesn't rise to the dignity of the Marvin case. You know, here he was praising the Marvin case, whereas a few years earlier I couldn't get anyone in the world to say that we had a chance on that. And everybody to the man said, or to the woman said, you're not going to do it with that case. So here was a judge recognizing. See, change comes slowly.
Well, if you're in Marvin's sort of situation, if people are living together without the benefit of clergy, isn't it true that the safest and most, the safest thing to do and the most careful thing to do is to write out some kind of a simple contract that says what your intentions are? If you start to try to prove an oral contract in those situations, it must be awfully hard to say, oh, he said to me on the 4th day of June when we went horseback riding that everything that was his was mine, or that kind of thing.
Gerald,
shouldn't people write it out?
It's the easiest thing to do and probably the best, but very few people do that. I find I've never seen a prenuptial agreement yet that didn't end up in a divorce. I think it's a blueprint and a recipe for divorce. When you sit down and you say, look, let's get married, or let's live together, but look at, if we break up, I want to keep this and I want that, and you don't get this and you get that. You know, people share their spirits, their bodies, their souls, their bread, their board. Why shouldn't they fairly share the property that they accumulate together in this sort of partnership-like relationship? The trouble with prenuptials and non-nuptial agreements in the case of palimony cases is that usually people aren't fair, and they will say everything I make is mine, and you know you can keep everything you make, but then they'll tell the woman not to work, for example.
Right.
They can't be fair. They can't be like estate planning, but they seldom are fair, and I think that they really bring dissension. And when they are unfair, the woman is sitting around, or the man, but the woman usually, and is thinking, gosh, if we break up, I have no security, and feels insecure in that kind of relationship.
And that harms the relationship itself,
harms
doesn't it?
yes,
They can't be
because
equals.
That's right, because people live together and, you know, get married. They're supposed to have a partnership kind of a life. And when you start saying, I'm going to keep this, I'm going to keep what, I'm going to take something the law otherwise wouldn't give me. See, that's what they really are, because the laws are there to really to protect people, and they're really fair as written, most of them. The trouble is in the palimony cases, our legislatures, and our legislature in California particularly, they just have been cowardly. They're just not they just don't go in and don't enact law that spells out these people's rights. So the only law we have is by case law. That's happened all over the country. I guess it's difficult for a legislator to get up and run for office and say, incidentally, I'm going to advocate that people who live together have some rights.
That's right, that's right.
So there's that political, you know, overhang there that keeps them from doing what should be done, really.
And it's really, if you really want certainty in your relationship and not to have to worry about all these things, you're simply better off just getting married, aren't you?
Well, I think you are, and I think it's, you know, I think more people have gotten married, and there's been sort of
It's nice to hear you
increase.
talk about being pro-marriage, Marvin.
I'm very pro-marriage. I've been married 27 years. I'm the only one I know who hasn't had a divorce. But of course, I'm not around much, and my wife's Italian, real tough lady.
That's a good way to avoid marital problems. Be on the road sometimes. I wonder if you see any changes. I feel like there's a lot of changes in the judicial system. I know we have some private judging nowadays, and you indicated earlier that you use some private judges. And the judges, it seems to me, I see a deterioration in the quality of just the appurtenances. In Santa Monica, the judges are sitting in trailers. There's a certain decay. I think there's a lot of younger judges who have less experience. How do you feel like the judge system is doing?
Well, we're really lagging way behind what we need. I mean, we don't really, you know, if you go downtown Los Angeles on a divorce case, believe me, it may be scheduled for April 2nd or 1st, and it's real April Fools, because when you get down there, that's just the roll call, and you may find yourself waiting 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or even 2 months to get out and get a trial. There are not enough judges. There are not enough courtrooms. There's not a speed up of the system. We have a long list of what we call rented judges, judges who retire that are excellent, some of them, because they've had 20, 25 years
I had
on the
Judge
bench.
Schote on this show a couple of months ago.
Right, and they're very, very helpful, and you can be heard much quicker. So I advocate, or I think everyone ought to take a rented judge when they can. There's a long list.
But you've got to be able to
choose,
afford a rented judge.
You have to be able to afford it, that's true. There should be some speed up in the system. We've developed a new program called the Fast Track program that started in January. It hasn't reached out to divorce cases yet, but in civil cases, you can get to trial maybe within a year, you know, by the judge, by being assigned one judge. That's the best way, I really think. It's like the federal system, and it's like in other states, in New York. You get one judge, and that judge takes care of his calendar and moves the case along. And when he says, come here on May 14th for a hearing, there's a hearing on May 14th, because he makes sure that the decks are cleared, and he's going to take you. So we need to modernize the system. We are doing that slowly, hopefully, surely.
But it's an incredibly backward system now. I mean,
backward.
they got computers into the appellate courts when Rose Bird was Chief Justice.
Right.
But I don't know that they have any computers going into the Superior Court. They're still using sort of a 19th century system, and the files, these large, huge amounts of files, and files get lost and things like that. Why don't we put more money into our civil justice system? The
I don't
lawyers
know why
are
we
making
don't.
money.
Well, I think we should. I mean, we just really have to do that. I think the public's, you know, there's a public feeling, I think, pretty much against lawyers in many ways. There's a lot of misconceptions. Perhaps we ought to have some education, more programs like this, frankly, where you talk about inside law and what really happens inside law, and not your perception of it, because you're just dealing with human beings like yourself. You know, the public and lawyers are human, and we need to develop the system better so the machinery really works.
That's right. That's right. Well, Marvin, we're near the end of the show, but I want to ask you this. Now, if you had it all over to do all over again, would you become a lawyer again and go into this sort of line of work, or maybe you'd do something else?
Well, they say that the law is a jealous mistress, and I do have a mistress. It is the law, and God's been good to me. I always say that, and I thank Him each day. I enjoy what I do. I like to think I work hard, but it isn't hard work when you enjoy it. I think I'd probably do it all almost the same way, and try to watch some of those mistakes I've made and maybe correct them, because we learn something every day. You know, every day I have a case, and I never underestimate my opponents. Sometimes my opponents have underestimated me, to their regret sometimes, and sometimes not to their regret, but I like to believe that everyone else thinks like, you know, has a mind and works on it and tries to do the best thing. I like the law, and we just hope to keep bettering the system.
Well, I want to thank you a lot for being on the show, Marvin. You're a really entertaining and interesting man, and you've been a great innovator in the legal system, and I have a feeling that there may be a few more innovations that come the system's way through your efforts. And I think you're right about the lawyers. It's the adversaries that keep us on our toes and keep the truth coming out into the legal system. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for watching our show today, and we look forward to having you be our guest again. If you have any questions or comments for us, please feel free to write care of this station. This has been Inside Law, and I'm your host, Gerald Goldfarb. Good day. For further information, please call Inside Law at area code 213-285-8599.